Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This week, let's talk about a couple of the bills that are going through the Senate because there's a little bit of drama around them. Two of those are C-48, which is the tanker ban bill, and C-69, which is the bill to reform the environmental assessment process in Canada. During the previous sitting week, C-48 suffered a sort of defeat in committee, while C-69 saw about 200-ish amendments at its committee, both of which are slated to report back to the Senate as a whole sometime this week, where we'll see a lot of interesting procedural drama happen, in part with the way in which the committee processes unfolded on both of those bills. With C-48, what happened at the Transport Committee was that a number of amendments were attempted, none of them passed, and when the committee chair asked whether the bill should be reported back unamended, it was a tie vote. That means in the Senate a failure. And in this case, what it means is a de facto report that the committee recommends the bill not proceed. That sets up a bit of a dynamic. It was reported that the bill was defeated but not dead, but that's not really true. But in this case, what it means is that the whole Senate will have a chance to reject that committee report. This will create an opening for amendments to be debated at third reading, which is supposed to be unusual, but is becoming more common with the way the Senate is working currently. And that will leave a very good chance that the bill will pass with maybe one or two amendments, but it will go forward almost certainly. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has largely been crowing in victory over this committee report and saying that he wants this bill to stay dead, even though it's not really dead, and he should know that. But it's part of this pressure campaign around these bills which he claims are going to be devastating to the oil industry. Analysis from respected economists have said that C-48 isn't going to have a material impact on the energy industry in Alberta or Saskatchewan because there are no pipelines that currently go through northern BC to any northern BC ports. And that's, and we're not going to see one because there's not, and almost certainly not going to be another attempted repeat at Northern Gateway. The finding of the Federal Court of Appeal on that regarding the Indigenous consultation set a fairly high bar that I'm not sure any government is going to want to spend that much political capital over, considering the general economic impact of the sector in what is moving toward a more carbon-constrained future, as well as the fact that, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion in southern BC is almost certainly slated to go ahead later this year. That consultation process is wrapping up now, and for as much as people will insist that the government doesn't plan on moving ahead with it, they've spent enough political capital and actual capital in buying the pipeline outright in order to de-risk it that it would not make sense for them to go ahead with it. And I know that there's this conspiracy theory going around that Trudeau bought the pipeline just to kill it, but that makes absolutely no sense at all because, this is reality we're dealing with. As for Bill C-69, I think it's going to be an interesting battle over amendments in the Senate itself. What happened at the committee was all of these amendments that got adopted largely were those written by the oil industry. And that guts a lot of what the government's intention with the bill was. So I think we're going to likely, in this case, have an instance where the Senate as a whole is very likely going to be rejecting that committee report as well. And then we'll be back to battling over amendments at third reading. I'm not sure that the Senate as a whole is interested in letting the oil and gas industry rewrite environmental assessment processes in this country, particularly given that, for example, the mining industry was in favor of the bill going into the Senate. But it also, I think, defeats the government's intention with the bill, which senators are very wary about going around. I mean, they do have that power of veto, but it needs to be exercised very carefully. And I'm not sure that this is necessarily a case where that's going to be an issue. I mean, there's no particularly constitutional constraints in this bill, despite what Jason Kenney's rhetoric is. So I'm not sure that there's a case for the Senate gutting a government bill in this case. We need to remember that much of the rationale for Bill C-69 was because when the previous Harper government essentially gutted the environmental assessment processes in 2012, that didn't lead to this opening up economically of the sector. What it led to was a whole lot of litigation because all of these rules and regulations that used to be in place were no longer there, and you had court battles over people fighting for not only the restoration of some of those, but also just for clarity in terms of the law. When you remove all this language out of legislation in order to streamline or cut red tape, you can end up creating uncertainty for industry, and that just leads to more litigation. And for conservatives and oil industry lobbyists to insist that that was the better approach forward, I'm not sure really understands the broader implications of what it is they're trying to propose. The other thing we need to remember with Bill C-69 is that even though it was not by any means a perfect bill, the fixes that most of the proponents on either the industry or environmentalist side were proposing were not the kind of wholesale gutting that ended up happening. A lot of them had to do with ensuring more clarity around timelines, wanted some tinkering around the selection of committees for offshore projects so that they weren't entirely industry captured, things like that. So I think that on the broader consensus, based on everything I've heard, a lot of the testimony that was at the committees and so on, that I don't know that writ large around Canada that what ended up happening to this bill is really palatable to most people. So again, I think this is going to be a situation where I think there will be a bunch of battling amendments within the Senate over what to include and what not to include at third reading. And I think we're going to see a lot of late nights and perhaps a little bit of acrimony. We should also recall that a few weeks ago when we had that whole issue in the Senate where the government leader, Peter Harder, tried to impose that programming motion and was smacked down, and a deal was struck for most bills in terms of timelines. The two that did not get any kind of timelines for third reading were C-48 and C-69. So what the Conservatives have essentially done in that situation is to basically invite Harder to try and do time allocation on these bills, because they're going to drag their heels at third reading for the next several weeks. There are only 4 sitting weeks left for the House of Commons, which is going to put an enormous amount of pressure on senators to try and move business forward. But I think is also setting up a situation where we might have to recall the House of Commons in July to sit for another week or two to deal with amended bills that come back from the Senate. So these are two key bills that are going to see a lot of wrangling over the next few weeks, and it'll be very interesting to see if final versions get passed back to the House of Commons before the end of June. So stay tuned, essentially, and I think it's going to be a rough few weeks for everyone involved. And that's it for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks, everyone.